Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Beginner's Guide for Automotive Photography. You are now on section 4, composition and choosing locations. If you've made it this far, that means you've got your camera, your lenses, your accessories, you know a few terms. Now you're ready to finally go take pictures of a car. Many people practice automotive photography by shooting their own cars, but by any means, get access to whatever car you can get access to and take photos of it. As a beginner, I would highly recommend that you take photos of either completely stock cars or maybe cars that are a little beat up and hard to make look beautiful. Reason being is that if you're always shooting really high-end cars right off the bat, the beauty of the car alone may be tricking you into thinking that you have a nice photo, when in reality, there may have been a few things that you could do better. With that being said, high-end cars can be difficult to shoot on their own, so if that's all you have access to, go for it. Now, once you actually have a car to take photos of, the next thing you need to deal with is picking a location. For me, I don't really live in a super nice area, so I've kind of adopted that work with what you've got mentality as far as locations are concerned, but there are a few things that I still try to keep in mind when booking shoots with clients. For example, if you're doing a photo shoot with a Jeep, you probably don't want to take it to the middle of downtown Los Angeles next to a bunch of tall buildings. A vehicle like that may be better suited for, say, a desert environment. On the flip side, if you're photographing a brand new Lamborghini, you probably don't want to take it into the middle of the desert somewhere. It may be better suited for an environment like downtown Los Angeles. Of course, these are just general rules of thumb that are meant to be broken. Sometimes it's really satisfying to shoot cars that are purposely completely out of their environment, like shooting a Lamborghini in the middle of the desert, for example, or shooting a Jeep in the middle of the city. Ultimately, you can get as creative as you'd like, but in the beginning stages, when you're not super creative just yet because you're still learning, try to fit the vehicle you're shooting to the environment you're bringing it to. Now, composition could be tricky. If you're going out and you're taking just 3, 4, maybe 5 photos of a car, the idea of finding compositions to take advantage of doesn't seem too difficult. But when a client hires you for a 30 to even 50 photo shoot and you have to get a little creative with your composition, that's where things get a little more difficult. Now, your composition, like we mentioned in terms and definitions, is essentially where your subject, background, and foreground are all located within your photo. One of the more difficult parts about being a car photographer is finding unique compositions to take in order to meet the photo requirements that your clients are looking for. If you're just going out for fun and you have no set amount of photos that you need to reach, coming up with creative compositions may not seem that difficult. But when somebody hires you to take, say, 50 photos of one car in one location, now you have to get a little bit creative. With that being said though, car photography definitely has its own unique set of challenges, but it is far from being the most difficult thing to take a photo of. If you don't believe me, try taking pictures of babies and animals. They're terrible listeners, they move all the time, and they're never going where you want them to. Cars, on the other hand, do exactly what you tell them to do. So in this case, I would recommend moving your cars several times during the photo shoots. Even if you're within just the same location, a simple U-turn of the car can unlock an entirely new set of compositions for you to choose from. The lighting is different, the background's slightly different. All of those things are things that you could take advantage of to deliver your clients more photos. If you're worried about not being able to deliver enough photos to your clients, don't worry, you can get a lot of photos out of very simple, easy to replicate compositions. For example, take these 3 photos that are appearing on screen now. We have a head-on front shot, a head-on rear shot, and a full side shot. Now, with both the head-on front and the head-on rear, you can get that same shot 2 separate times just by flipping the car around, and chances are the background and foreground are going to be slightly different. Furthermore, for the side shots, you can also reverse the car just like you would with a head-on shot, but there are 2 sides of a car, obviously. So you could get a side shot of each side of the car and then flip the car around, do those same 2 shots again, and you've got yourself 4 unique compositions. Viewing composition in this way makes it so much easier to approach a set and feel confident that you're going to be able to deliver a large volume of unique photos. Head-on front and head-on rear shots, as well as side shots, are far from the only compositions that you can do as a car photographer. There are 3/4 rear views, 3/4 front views, head-on shots from above, head-on shots from below. side shots with foreground in them, side shots with no foreground in them. To take it one step further, like we talked about in the lens discussion in the previous section, each focal length that you use will also produce a different result. So not only can you get these same compositions each time, but if you're changing your focal length, you're also able to get unique compositions without really changing much of what you're doing. With all of this in mind, it should be no problem at all delivering 20 to 30 edited photos for each car set that you do. It's always a good rule of thumb to do a complete 360 around the car several times while you're taking a photo of it. You can go from head-on shot to 3/4 front view to full-on side shot to 3/4 rear view to head-on side shot, 3/4 rear view again, side shot from the other side, and just work your way around getting all of those unique compositions. Now, let's take it one step further. These are all compositions that I've listed that include the entire car and frame. But if you look through a car photographer's portfolio, you'll notice that not every single one of their pictures has the entire car and frame. That gives you access to an entire new library of compositions to choose from. You could do a head-on shot of each of the 4 wheels. There's 4 unique compositions for you right there. You could do a 3/4 shot of each wheel. What about the logos on the hood as well as the trunk? What about the headlights? What about the taillights? Steering wheel, front seats, shifter, rear seats, etc. Now, these are all fairly cookie cutter basic compositions. You may be wondering, how do you take the structure of everything that I've listed and turn it into something that creates a unique image? This is where you start playing with things like foreground and background. Me personally, I am a huge fan of using foreground in my photos. Let me give you an example of what I mean by using foreground in my photos. Take a look at this photo of a steering wheel inside my BMW station wagon. Now, I very well could have just taken this shot head on of the steering wheel, only really showing the steering wheel and frame. However, I personally feel that having the edge of the front seat in the right corner of the frame blurred out a little bit adds a little bit of more of a dynamic flair to this image. I am always trying to find excuses to use foreground. If I find a bush, I love getting behind the bush and using that as the bottom edge of my photo, having that being completely blurry, but having the subject being a car in the middle of the frame completely in focus. So knowing now that you can use foreground, you now have to choose what you're going to use as foreground. With something like a steering wheel, you really only have a few options, right? You can use the side of the front seat, the inside of the window sill. Maybe you can get away with using the mirror somehow. But you'll notice too, while you're at a specific location, that certain locations offer you the ability to use unique foreground. That is something else that you should consider when choosing locations. Are there cool objects around that you can use as foreground? For example, are there trees nearby that you can cover half the frame with the leaves of? Are there bushes that you can stand either behind or in front of to create a unique look? Try to think of not only what location is going to suit that car best, but what location is going to make it easiest for you to create dynamite images. For me, I love having blurry elements of the photo because when you have parts of the photo that are extremely blurry compared to the thing that you have in focus, it gives the viewer this illusion that your subject is more in focus than it actually is because their only direct comparison is everything that's blurry in the photo. This is a great way to get awesome photos on cheaper camera rigs. If you have that really nice shallow depth of field with multiple items in frame that are blurry, that can really bring your image to life. The other thing that you need to keep in mind as far as composition is concerned is whether you'd like to shoot portrait or landscape. Now, there has been a huge influx of people that have started shooting portrait style photography, mainly because social media seems to prefer those aspect ratios. For me, I have developed a preference for landscape photos. I really like the way that landscape photos can look like a still image from a movie, and that alone has basically converted me into almost an exclusive landscape shooter. But portrait compositions tend to give a little more emphasis to the actual subject, so if that's your thing, portrait photography may be the way for you. If you're like me and you enjoy viewing your images as quote-unquote hypothetical stills of a movie, then maybe landscape photography is for you. At the end of the day, we're all allowed to have our own preferences, but who gets the final say, obviously, is your client. If they have a preferred way of getting the photo photos delivered, you should deliver it to them the way they expect it. If you're doing work for somebody's social media, 9 times out of 10, they're gonna ask you for either portrait photos or something at a 4:5 aspect ratio, which is essentially just a square. The next thing that we have to talk about in relation to composition is something called the rule of thirds. Without getting too technical, the rule of thirds is essentially a photography rule where you place your subject either slightly off to the left center of the photo or slightly off to the right center of the photo, as opposed to placing your subject directly in the center. Some of your cameras may have a grid display when you look through the viewfinder to show if your image is straight and aligned. But you can also use this grid to place your subject in a rule of thirds-esque fashion. You see those two vertical lines that are not exactly on center, one's a little off to the left, one's a little off to the right. You can place your subject in either one of those areas, and that creates an image that follows the rule of thirds. Again, this is not a dead set rule. There really are no dead set rules in photography per se, but again, you can use this rule of thirds to create more unique compositions for yourself. If you got a head-on shot of the car directly in center of the frame, maybe step off to the right a bit, keep it in towards the left of the frame, and try that composition to see if you like that better. Again, every composition is going to depend heavily on the location that you're in, so not every composition is always going to work for you every single time. That's why it's important to always experiment and have as many options in your pocket going into a shoot as you possibly can. On screen, I have 2 photos from the same photo shoot. One shows a car in the dead center of the frame, not following the rule of thirds. This other photo shows the subject slightly off to the left, indicating that it does follow the rule of thirds. The next composition-related topic that I would like to discuss is something called negative space. Despite what you may have heard from recent college graduates, a negative space is not an area where people are being mean to you. Negative space refers to all the area of your photo that your subject isn't taking up, so this would include your foreground and your background. Negative space is something that's important to pay attention to because you want to make sure that the subject is placed exactly where you want it to be. So for example, if you're going for a dead center head-on shot, you would like to make sure that you have an equal amount of foreground to background. A mistake I see a lot of beginner photographers make is not having even negative space. So for example, they take a head-on shot of a car where there's maybe only an inch of ground showing and 9 inches of sky showing. That would be an example of a misuse of negative space. Or maybe that's exactly what the person was going for and it was at their creative discretion to take that composition. Like I said before, there are no real rules here. However, I would try to advise you to let the car breathe a little bit, so to speak. And what I mean by that is just making sure that there is always at least a little bit of negative space in the photo. When you have the car really tightly cropped towards the edges, either the vertical edges or the horizontal edges, it just makes the car look stuffed and claustrophobic, at least in my opinion. So I try to give the car enough space all around. But again, no rules in photography, 100% up to you. It's also worth mentioning, especially as a beginner car photographer, that while you're at these shoots, you need to constantly be checking your photos. For example, you may run up to a car, you really want to get the shot, you go to take the picture, you look through the viewfinder and you're like, oh shoot, I need more light. And so you adjust your shutter speed. But you don't realize that you adjust your shutter speed too low and all of those photos from that angle came out blurry because you were either shooting too slow or your hands weren't steady enough to take that shot. So just make sure after you take each photo that you're clicking your playback button, looking at the photos either on your phone or on your camera, confirming that everything that needs to be in focus actually is in focus, and then moving on to your next shot. I'm gonna go off track real quick to talk about something else that I think is really important, and that's called focus peaking. What focus peaking is a setting on some cameras that basically allows you to see in highlighted color what parts of your photo are actually in focus. If you found yourself in a situation where you have a manual focus only lens, focus peaking is an absolute lifesaver. So if that's something you've run into, please look that up somewhere, figure out how to use it on your specific camera. It will change your life. Getting back on track, at the end of the day, the car that you're shooting isn't going to go anywhere. You have as much time to take the photo in relation to obviously everybody's schedule as you need. Don't feel rushed. Don't try to blast through the thing in 20 minutes. If you have an hour to shoot, take the full hour to shoot. Even if you think a particular angle might be weird, just grab it anyway. The more photos you get early on in your career, the faster you're gonna find what compositions you do like, what compositions you don't like, and you'll naturally start to get faster taking good photos every time you go out to take a set. I encourage you to be creative, especially with detail shots. There are so many little tiny details throughout cars that you can get really cool photos of. But a lot of manufacturers place logos on the insides of the cars as well, sometimes stitching them into the headrests of the seats, sometimes stitching them into the armrests, sometimes they've got the little door sills with logos on them. Be creative, find all the little details that the manufacturers were so stoked to put in these cars in the first place, and get photos of them. Now, speaking of detail shots, this is something that I definitely want to warn you guys about. 90% of beginner car photographers that I see that go to take detail shots shoot detail shots at wide open apertures. This is a huge mistake. Listen, when you're 20 feet away from a car and you're shooting it at a 3/4 angle at f2.8, you might get the whole car in focus based on the distance that you're standing away from that car. But if you were hovering right on top of a logo on a floor mat, for example, at slightly an angle, and you think f1.8 is going to get both corner edges of that logo, you're out of your mind. The closer you are to an object, the more sensitive the background blur in your photo is going to be. So for detail shots, the closer you get, the narrower your aperture needs to be. You don't want to be caught taking a 3/4 taillight shot, only getting the lower right-hand corner of the taillight in focus, while the actual light that you were looking to get is completely blurry in the background. Just a piece of advice that I thought that I would offer all of you, because it's a mistake that I definitely made several times early on in my career. But let's say that you've heard everything that I've had to say, you've gone out to a couple car shoots, you're still struggling, and you don't understand how to take the exact right composition that you're looking for. One of the things that I am a huge fan of is using other car photographers as inspiration. One may call it copying or cheating or whatever you may want to call it, but at the end of the day, you have to go to a unique location, shoot a unique car with your unique camera, and then edit it with your unique style. So even if you are taking inspiration from somebody else, if you're doing all the work yourself, there really is no copying happening. For me, one of my biggest inspirations is a guy named Craven. I'll post his Instagram up on the screen, but basically for years, I would go through each one of this guy's photo sets, looking at all the individual pictures and just being wowed at how amazing all of them were. But more importantly, it inspired me to want to create better images. I wanted to be like Craven. So I studied and I studied and I studied, and eventually I did develop my own style, but I can say for certainty that I've taken a lot of inspiration from that gentleman and many other people that I admire. So moral of the story, don't be afraid to look through other people's work, see what you like about it, see what you don't like about that, and implement it into your own workflow. So now let's talk about actually setting up your shot. You know what composition that you want to take, you're in the location, you have the car, you're ready to go. So really, the most important thing that you need to do in that circumstance is set up your exposure. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky, because of course, like I mentioned before, there are concrete values for what perfect exposure is. However, perfect exposure isn't always the look that we're going for. Furthermore, if you're looking to edit your photos, sometimes it's helpful to either underexpose or overexpose depending on what your camera's capabilities are. Let me give you a specific example. I personally do all of my car photography with Sony cameras, more specifically my Sony a7 III that I've brought up a couple of times in previous sections. Far and away, the biggest benefit of using Sony cameras is that their shadow recovery on edited photos is absolutely ridiculous. What I mean by that is that I can underexpose a photo by 1, 2, sometimes even 3 stops. But once I pull the photo in Lightroom, I pull the shadows up, I pull the blacks up, turn the exposure up a little bit, and the photo is perfectly clear and bright. Parts of the photo that were completely dark in the unedited version completely come back to life once you add some adjustments in Lightroom. The point in me mentioning this is that I prefer to underexpose my raw photos when shooting with a Sony camera, because I know the camera is much better at recovering detail from darker parts of the photo than brighter parts of the photo. But not all cameras are created equal. Some cameras perform better when you overexpose photos, Some prefer just for you to have perfect exposure. So what I would recommend is find a car that you can take photos of really quickly, go outside and grab some photos. Take the same composition 5 times, but change your shutter speed up and down in between each shot. This should leave you with 5 unique photos ranging from bright to dark. We're gonna touch more on how to use Adobe Lightroom later, but if you're already familiar with how to use the program, load the photos up on your computer, edit all 5 photos, and see which exposure retained the most overall detail. That will give you a pretty clear indication of how you should shoot most of your raw photos going forward. What I've noticed though is that most cameras will do a little bit better when you underexpose the photo versus when you overexpose them. Sky detail is extremely difficult to get back if in the original photo your sky is completely white and maybe in real life it was actually blue with some clouds in it. However, cameras nowadays seem to be pretty good at shadow recovery, Sony obviously in my opinion being the best, so that's why I choose to underexpose my shots. You can also use this same strategy of taking 5 photos at different settings for learning your ISO capabilities. Go outside, take 5 shots, all at the exact same composition. The only thing different is that you're shooting at higher ISO values each time. This will allow you to get a good gauge of what your max ISO value is on your camera that you can run before your photos become unusable. This may sound confusing, but trust me, if you go outside right now and take a photo at 10,000 ISO and pull it up on your computer, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so you're out in the field, you're taking photos, you're getting ready to take a shot. Maybe you have the question, Ethan, how do I know when I'm supposed to adjust my shutter speed? Now, in my opinion, shutter speed is the setting that you are going to be adjusting most frequently while you're taking photos. Reason being is that if you are shooting a static car, shutter speed is the setting that has the least impact on anything other than just the brightness of your photo. If you adjust your aperture, the amount of background blur that you have is going to be different. If you raise your ISO, the amount of noise and grain in your image is going to be different. But if you adjust your shutter speed and everything in your frame isn't moving, then it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. Of course, if you shoot too low and you're handheld, the photo will come out a little bit blurry because in that case you would need a tripod, but I think you guys understand the point that I'm trying to make. However, you will need to adjust your shutter speed when you're doing rolling shots to a specific value. This is because you need to shoot at a low enough shutter speed to make sure that the car is in focus, but that the wheels of the car look like they're moving. We'll go more into detail in the next section about how to set up those settings properly, but that's really the only scenario where your shutter speed is really sensitive for car photography specifically. Okay, so now that you know when to adjust your shutter speed, when are you supposed to adjust your aperture? Well, this one is mostly up to you. The amount of background blur that you would like to have in an image is obviously up to your discretion. However, keep in mind that tip that I gave you earlier where I said when shooting detail shots, you may need to shoot at a little more of a narrow aperture in order to get that small detailed item fully in focus. Even if you're always going for the most background blur possible, if you want your subject fully in focus, make sure you adjust your aperture right to the value where your subject is completely in focus, but everything else is not. Unfortunately, there is no real concrete safe value for aperture. It's going to depend entirely on each individual thing that you're taking pictures of, as well as the environment that you're taking photos of it in. Also, I skipped past this term in the second section, but something worth noting is the term bokeh. Bokeh is a fancy word for the amount of background blur that you have in your image, but I figured it was worth sharing that with you because if you're around other photographers frequently enough, you are definitely going to hear that word. So, last but not least, when are you supposed to adjust your ISO? If I am being brutally honest with you, my answer is almost never. Like I mentioned in a previous section, ISO is the only one of the settings within the exposure triangle that can actually make your image quality worse. Just a quick recap, ISO changes your camera's sensitivity to light, but the way that I explained it is that it's essentially adding artificial brightness to your photo. Just like when you brighten up your photo on an editing software, you will start to lose detail and see noise. The more you raise your ISO, the more noise and grain that you're going to have in your image. So you're gonna have to play around with your particular camera, figure out where your safe values for ISO are so you know not to go above that. But again, like I mentioned before, I will always adjust my shutter speed and aperture before I adjust my ISO, unless I'm in a situation like rolling shots, for example, where my shutter speed and my aperture have to be locked at specific values. The next thing that we have to talk about is lighting. Now, just like everything else in photography, lighting is extremely subjective. Some people like taking their subjects into the shade. Some people like taking their subjects out in the sun. Some people like having their subjects half in the shade and half in the sun. It's ultimately, again, like most things in photography, up to you. However, I have noticed that shooting in the sun in the middle of the day is significantly harder, especially for cars that are bright colored. Basically, when you find yourself in a situation where the lighting environment of your subject and the background are very different, that's when you're gonna have a lot of difficulties. For example, if you're shooting a car in the shade that's, say, under some trees, in order to get the photo bright enough to where you could see the car, you're most likely going to have to make the sky in between the gaps in the tree branches so bright that you can't see any detail in it anymore. Now, again, some people like having blown out skies in their images and they play into that as a part of their style, but it's worth noting that putting yourself in situations where the lighting environment is very different in different areas, it'll make your life insanely difficult. That's why shooting on gloomy days is so easy. You don't have the harsh light from the sun conflicting with the lighting that you need to get the car bright. You can usually make photos of cars on a gloomy day bright enough to where you can see the car without blowing out the sky. But if it's a bright sunny day out, if you're making the photo bright enough to where you can see all the details of the car, you may lose the detail in the sky. If you're trying to shoot at night, that term light painting that I had mentioned before is going to come extremely in handy. You're either going to have to light paint, meaning you walk around the car with a light while the photo is being taken to brighten it up, or you're gonna have to take a long exposure so that the photo is bright enough to capture the car. But even still, most people's ideas of night photography with cars comes down to light painting, because if you do a long exposure of just a car with no external light source, it doesn't really look that cool. The paint doesn't really have anything to reflect off of. There's nothing pushing into the paint to show off metallic flake or the deepness in the color or anything like that. So if you're gonna shoot at night, you're gonna need some lights for sure. Well, let's say you're shooting at night and you have no lights. The safest bet for a car shoot is going to a gas station. Gas stations have excellent lighting. The photos almost always come out really, really cool because the cars at the end of the day are in their natural environment. But do keep in mind that if you're gonna shoot at night, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna need a tripod to keep the camera steady enough to take those photos at a lower shutter speed. Now, I'd like to say that basically everything that I mentioned in this section is incredibly important, but what is more important than anything else that I mentioned is that you need to get out and practice. Take the same photos with different settings to figure out what your camera's limits are. Take photos at different times of the day to see which lighting scenarios you prefer to shoot in the most. Borrow as many lenses as you can, borrow as many cameras as you can, just get out there and produce as much content as you humanly possibly can. At the end of the day, the more mistakes that you're able to make and catch early on in your career, the quicker you're gonna end up being the professional that we all want you to be. So with that being said, that concludes section 4. Let's get into the most exciting section of this guide, rollers and panning shots.